I didn't send sources today because I wanted to take us in a bit of a different direction. Not a different direction, but it wasn't necessarily a source-based direction. I think there was a very important conversation that had to be had with regard to what we discussed last week and to clarify some of the things that were said there. We are really on a topic of Yirat Hashem. The performance of mitzvot are described as having two wings. And the two wings are the love of God and the awe, reverence, fear of God. And when our avodat Hashem has those two qualities to it, it has the power to fly up to where it needs to go. I'm approaching the other 7 mitzvot, the other 6 mitzvot. We've, in a certain sense, done the prohibition against avodah zarah by speaking about what it means to believe in God. And now we are dealing with the prohibitive aspect of the Sheva mitzvot b'nei Noach. As we know, they are all essentially negative commandments. Well, negative commandments which tell us to refrain from doing certain things, is a specific aspect of serving God. And that is having the fear of God, having awe and reverence for God, and therefore we dare not behave or act in specific ways. So the first of the mitzvot that we touched upon with regard to this orientation in mitzvot was the prohibition against blasphemy. And we're going to talk more about that tonight, but in a different way. And I just wanted to give us a little more of an outline. When we speak about Yirat Hashem, when we speak about the fear of God, there are 3 levels that are described in Yirat Hashem, in the fear of God. The first level, which could be considered to be the lowest level, would be Yirat HaOnesh, which means fear of punishment. We know that the Torah mentions the various mitzvot, both positive and negative, and has 2 aspects to that. One being the warning, and the other being the consequence. So with regard to the consequence, we don't want to be like little children who only do things because we think we're going to get in trouble if we don't, or only refrain from doing things because we think we're going to get in trouble if we don't. But on the other hand, if we did not have that taken into account, it's likely that we would let ourselves go a little bit more than we should. Right? Meaning that's the nature, that's the purpose of the presence of government in the life of a country. It says in Pirkei Avot that we should pray for the peace of the government, because without the government, people would tear each other apart. People would eat each other alive. Therefore, we understand that the fear of the consequences of our actions shapes what we do. And we have a ruling power, be it the government itself, be it the police, be it the courts, that keeps us in line. That is the first level of Yirat Hashem. The second level of Yirat Hashem is Yirat Hachet, is actually the fear of sin itself. Why? What's what's that all about? What we are looking for is kirva lelokim, his closeness to God. We achieve closeness to God by doing what he wants us to do, by incorporating the ways of the Torah into our lives, by doing good in this world. It's kind of a two-part program of sur me'ra, flee from evil, v'aseh tov, and do good. The Ramchal explains in Mesilat Yesharim that ultimately, it's not in Mesilat Yesharim, it's in Derech Hashem, that ultimately, when we invest ourselves in doing good, we are going to be naturally moving away from what's bad. But being able to experience closeness with God is really the ultimate good. That's what Olam Haba is about. And we can have a sense of that in Olam Hazeh as well, in this world as well. So Yirat Achet really, if you think about relationships, people that you love very dearly and that you care for, there are certain things that you don't do because you don't want to create a barrier between you and the other person. You don't want to distance the other person from you. That's the effect of sin. Sin distances us from God. It makes our relationship with him much less personal. That's the second level. You can hear in that it's a more mature level than simply being afraid of getting a spanking for doing the wrong thing. But then there is the top level. And this level is called Yirat HaRomimut, which is when a person has reached a certain level of consciousness about God, his awesomeness. You know, when you're standing on a cliffside, or you can see the northern lights, or you're absolutely overwhelmed by the massiveness of things, that's an experience of Romamut, of the Romamut is the exaltedness of it, the exaltedness of God. When you have progressed in your own spiritual development to the point where you can really sense that God's awesomeness, God's omniscience, his omnipotence, his omnipresence, anything that would take you away from that awareness of that consciousness is something that you'd want to stay away from. So Yira has these three levels to it, and there's other descriptions of it as well. But I think the importance of this is that it's something that grows with you. It's not just it's not just a binary thing, like you have it or you don't have it. It's something that you develop and you grow with, and you integrate this into your life over time. Now, the exploration of Yirat Hashem, the awe and reverence for God, and its connection to the prohibition on blasphemy, reveals an individual's private victory, a private triumph of getting to the point of refraining from disrespecting God. And what we're going to talk about now is kind of a navigation of the historical trajectory of something that we've been seeing in the world, which I want to distinguish from our conversation on blasphemy. To review, the Torah's concept of blasphemy differs from other religions. It's considered such a terrible sin that the sages, Chazal, refer to it with a euphemism as blessing God, not wanting to use the word curse. And the thrust of what we spoke about last time was that if a person can cultivate a healthy orientation of awe and reverence for God, one of the things that he or she would never do would be to blaspheme. Now, although the Jewish people have not pursued active proselytizing since ancient times, when it became very dangerous to do so, and we haven't had a program of missionizing or mass-scale conversions, there's definitely support in some parts of the Jewish world for a promotion of the Noahide laws, since these concern the rest of humanity. It's also natural for Noahides themselves to want to spread the Torah's teachings about the Noahide laws in the world, if for no other reason than the fact that the adoption of the laws by humanity would create a decent and moral society. However, the clarification I want to make is that we must not confuse this universal vision with attempts that have been made by international bodies such as the UN Human Rights Council to criminalize what they refer to as defamation of religion. Now, this is a very interesting piece of history. When we introduced the topic of blasphemy in the context of Yirat Hashem, what we meant was that the individual person who works to increase their awe and reverence for God will refrain from behaving disrespectfully towards God, meaning that not committing blasphemy is the fruit of Yirat Hashem. It's a private victory. It's not a public campaign. And as I just mentioned, there has been a sustained campaign to prevent the defamation of religion. In the late 90s and early 2000s, this issue gained momentum when the Organization of Islamic Countries, which eventually became the Organization of the Islamic Conference, expressed concerns about what it perceived as the defamation of Islam. Right, this conversation really opened in those international legal circles as how to prevent the defamation of Islam specifically. And the OIC argued that certain forms of expressions, such as cartoons and writings that were critical of Islam, amounted to an attack on religious sentiments. And as a matter of fact, there are laws when you move east in the world against inflaming religious tensions, offending people's religious sensibilities. There are jail sentences and sometimes even stricter punishments that are given for these kinds of things. Between the years 2005 and 2009, the OIC started introducing resolutions at the UN Human Rights Council and the UN General Assembly calling for measures against defamation of religions, plural. So in a way, it sounded like it was becoming more universal, like nobody should ever speak badly about any religion. These resolutions aimed to criminalize the defamation of religion, particularly Islam, and sought to establish a global framework to counter what the OIC viewed as Islamophobia. Now, there was a lot of criticism and a lot of opposition to these measures. The resolutions faced very significant criticism from countries and organizations which typically advocate the freedom of expression, which is what one of the values that we have in the West. Critics argued that such resolutions could be used to stifle legitimate criticism and limit freedom of speech and suppress dissenting voices. So there was a change in approach that took place by 2009, there was a shift in the language of the resolutions. The UN Human Rights Council passed a resolution that focused on combating religious discrimination and intolerance instead of criminalizing the defamation of religion. Why did this happen? Partly in response to the concerns raised by those defending freedom of expression. Because although the OIC is an organization that has 57 member states, and if you look at the UN as a whole, which operates according to a democratic process, the world is far outnumbered by these countries. So it's very difficult to have a world body that speaks for everybody without it being skewed very, very far in that direction. In 2011, I think was the most recent one of these resolutions, they abandoned the term defamation of religion altogether. The OIC at that point was collaborating with the United States and other countries when they introduced this resolution at the Human Rights Council. Now it focused on combating intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief, emphasizing the protection of individuals rather than religions. Once these adjustments were made, the resolution passed. And the current approach, subsequent resolutions at the UN have continued along the lines of protecting individuals from discrimination and violence based on their religion or belief, avoiding the blanket criminalization of defamation of religion, which is really what was desired when it was first submitted. And I want to make a note that the country that was really behind these measures to begin with was Pakistan. And that's, I think, very significant. Because there are several ironies in this story. The defamation of religion project began as an attempt by the OIC to have criticism of religion, particularly their religion, classified as a human rights abuse. But there were a series of events in the background that showed how some followers of Islam presented their religion to the Western world during that period of time in a rather negative light. You may remember, for example, the fatwa that was issued by the Ayatollah Khomeini in 1989 against the author Salman Rushdie for his book, The Satanic Verses. By the way, the fatwa is a demand for the death of the person, by the way, and it remains in effect to this day. Salman Rushdie, as far as I know, has security full-time to protect him, and there have been attempts made. Or the case of the cartoon of Muhammad that was published in the Jyllands-Posten in Denmark in 2005, which led to protests in which people lost their lives, and what amounted to an economic hijacking of the Danish economy by Muslim-majority countries. Or the Charlie Hebdo massacre, which happened in 2015. This is already after all these resolutions had been published. 4 years after the adoption of the resolution, which was worded to protect people from violence based on their belief and promote tolerance. This was an event where terrorists in Paris killed 12 people and injured 11, while hostages were also taken at a nearby kosher grocery store. So it's a bit ironic that proponents of Islam were advocating for tolerance and for the protection of the defense of people based on their belief. not wanting to paint with too broad a brush, I understand that there are people with more moderate views. And of course, you can promote tolerance, but you can't really legislate it. In the Torah, we have 613 mitzvot, or if you're a ben or bat noach, there are 7 with all of the auxiliary mitzvot. The mitzvot are legislating behavior. They don't legislate personality traits. Personality traits are a much grayer area where a person has to take responsibility for their own development. It's not to say that the Torah doesn't give a pretty clear picture as to what's right and what's wrong, but you can't legislate tolerance. You can't force people to be tolerant because it has to be cultivated and it has to be warranted. It has to be something that the other person, the other side deserves. The philosopher Karl Popper has said the following. He said, quote, "Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, if we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant, then the tolerant will be destroyed and tolerance with them." And this is what he termed the paradox of tolerance, that at times you need to be intolerant of intolerance. Right. So these UN resolutions employ words like tolerance, I believe, to mask what their real intentions are, which is to prevent people from defaming Islam. And they don't really offer tolerance in return. The open democratic society does not have the apostasy stigma that you will find in Muslim countries, nor the rage associated with blasphemy. It's especially ironic that Pakistan was the main player behind this legislation, at least at first. Pakistan is a country where Shia Muslims and religious minorities have faced very lethal discrimination throughout the years. We're talking about people being blown up in their religious buildings, in schools, in cemeteries. I mean, thousands of people throughout the decades have been subject to this, not to mention the fact that Pakistan, during the war in Afghanistan, bombed the Shiites in Afghanistan. And of course, the fact that they just expelled 1 million ethnic Afghanis. No one has said one word about that, by the way, in the midst of this war that we're in. No one has said a thing. We need to distinguish the Torah's injunction against blasphemy from all of that. It's not aimed at societies. It's aimed at the individual practitioner. It's not intended to be a restriction on free speech or critical thought. And therefore, the possibility of religious debate remains open, even when we speak of the Torah itself. It might not be a comfortable conversation. But let's say a woman wants to understand exactly how, in a post-feminist world, the Torah can demand specific types of dress and standards of modesty. They need to be able to ask those questions and get real substantive answers. And those of us who understand Judaism, understand Torah, need to be able to understand the issues ourselves. We don't skirt around those issues. And what I encourage everybody here to do is to ask all those questions. Because at no point does the inquiry become blasphemous. At no point does the inquiry become offensive. As a matter of fact, that lasted over centuries. All for the purpose,
You
by
have
the
to
way.
go a little bit back because there was an interruption. So just go a little bit what you said before. We missed now.
How long? How much is a little bit?
3 minutes.
3 minutes?
Yeah, do 2 minutes. Then I can cut it.
Oh. 3 minutes ago. What was I saying 3 minutes ago?
Do 2 minutes.
Okay.
Just go a little bit back.
Sure. The Torah's injunction against blasphemy is not aimed at societies. It's aimed at the individual practitioner. It's not intended to be a restriction on free speech or critical thought. Therefore, the possibility of religious debate remains open. Even when we speak of the Torah itself, people need to ask questions and have their questions answered. There is no question that is offensive. You know, there is a certain point where modernity seems to clash with what we see written down in ancient texts. And we have questions about that. When we see that humanity has been brought to such an unbelievable degree of technological advantage and capability, we have questions about the role of Hashem in our lives and how we can consider ourselves, let's say, dependent upon. I mean, these are not offensive questions. The Torah encourages these questions. The entire Talmud is a transcript of religious debates. Criticism of religious ideas and beliefs, again, they're not necessarily comfortable conversations, but they're allowed and they're important. And that's how we grow. The problem of the UN resolutions is that they attempt to misconstrue criticism of religion as a form of human rights abuse for those people who feel offended. The counter argument has been that beliefs don't have rights. Human beings have rights. Also, because the impetus behind the UN resolution was to prevent insult to Islam, although this was repackaged later as protecting any religion. Of course, the adherents of other religions hadn't asked for it. But because we tend to associate Islam with particular regions and cultures in the world, a strange synthesis occurred. It was as if, like, if you criticized Islam, you were not only defaming a religion, you were also being a bigot and a racist. Hence the concept of Islamophobia. Well, such a synthesis of religion and race is very potent. It works very well against tolerant Westerners whose greatest fear is to be labeled a racist and to be publicly canceled and politically incorrect in these kind of Maoist type of denouncing ceremonies and Maoist type public confessions that we've seen over the past few years. If you want people from open, democratic, and politically correct societies to do your bidding, you disarm them first by calling them racists. But religion is not a race. And criticism of religions is not a human rights abuse. And the attempt to force tolerance, as we're beginning to see, has the reverse effect. By the way, have you noticed that no public figure of late can seem to address the problem of anti-Semitism without mentioning Islamophobia? As if the two are identical twins. It's almost politically incorrect to speak of anti-Semitism by itself. It's as if you're ignoring the Muslims or taking a side in the war against Hamas. Now, there's been a lot of hype about, wow, there's been this big spike in Islamophobic incidents around the world. And just at this time, when you see 300,000 people marching on Armistice Day in London, which is very offensive given the national significance of the day for people who are honoring their fallen soldiers. And you see expressions of support for Hamas and a complete denial of what they did and a dismissal of it as pure propaganda and the ripping down of posters that have hostages' pictures on them everywhere. Not to mention the ripping down of national flags. There was some rally in New York where they tore down American flags and left the Palestinians up. And I looked at statistics, I believe that came from the Bureau of Criminal Justice in America. There has been no massive spike in Islamophobic incidents, while there has been an explosion of anti-Semitism around the world. The problem with equating the two is if we were to take apart the compound words anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, we might need to conclude that a comparison between them constitutes a category mistake, since each term points to an altogether different thing. Whereas anti-Semitism really means a hatred of Jews specifically, no matter what their religion, the religious or political views might be. Islamophobia suggests an irrational fear or phobia of the religion itself. Question is, in light of what we see in the world, whether that is actually an irrational fear or not. And the term Islamophobia singles out Islam as the trigger of fear. Now, as I said before, perhaps more tolerant and moderate Muslims suffer because of a reputation created by Muslim extremists. But that's an altogether different issue than anti-Semitism. And that was a big aside. But what I wanted to do in this conversation was draw a very, very clear line between the Torah's concept of blasphemy and the attempts that we have seen in the world to make the conversation about religion verboten. Because truthfully, blasphemy in Torah law is only about God. It has nothing to do with religion per se. Religion, religious practices, religious ideas are absolutely open for debate. Whereas the approach that has been taken by these international bodies has been to try to shut down the conversation altogether to avoid offense. But of course, avoiding offense takes us out of the basic value that we have in open democratic societies of freedom of expression and makes things rather boring. So in conclusion, the journey from attempting to criminalize defamation of religion to a more nuanced approach reflects the complexities of balancing free speech and religious criticism and human rights. The Torah's focus is on individual behavior rather than societal restriction, and it allows for religious debate while emphasizing the personal responsibility to revere and fear God. Torah enables us to distinguish between individual rights and beliefs, and it advocates for a more comprehensive understanding of freedom in an open democratic society while cultivating within ourselves a greater awe for God. And that's something that can influence the world for good. So we should all be blessed to be able to incorporate these qualities into our own life and to grow this way so that the world feels the influence and is encouraged to come aboard.